Jonathan Hale was a man who loved words. Born in the small town of Milford, he grew up debating with his father at the dinner table about politics, ethics, and philosophy. By the time he was 30, Jonathan had become a respected lawyer, known for his sharp tongue and his ability to tear apart an opponent's case with precision. But while his professional life thrived, his personal life began to quietly crumble. Friends avoided discussions with him, colleagues found him difficult to work with, and his wife often ended their conversations in silence, weary of his relentless need to win every point. Jonathan didn't see it at first, because to him, winning the argument meant proving he was right. What he didn't realize was that, in winning the argument, he was losing the person. One autumn afternoon, Jonathan attended a community town hall about the future of Milford's River, which had been polluted by a local factory. Citizens filled the hall, their voices rising in heated debate. Jonathan, confident in his skill, rose to speak. He launched into a thunderous argument, dismantling the opposing views with facts, figures, and a hint of sarcasm. By the end of his speech, he was certain he had won the room. But as he sat down, he noticed folded arms, hard stares, and a silence that did not feel like agreement. It felt like resentment. The townspeople weren't persuaded, they were alienated. Jonathan left that hall with applause ringing only in his own ears, blind to the fact that no one had truly joined his side. That evening, Jonathan's mentor, an old judge named Harrison, visited him. The judge had watched the debate unfold, and though he admired Jonathan's skill, he shook his head slowly. "Jonathan," he said, "you were brilliant, but brilliance isn't influence. You cut their arguments to pieces, but you didn't win their hearts. Remember this, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still." Jonathan, prideful, brushed off the comment, but the words lingered in the back of his mind like an echo he couldn't silence. Weeks later, Jonathan faced his reckoning at home. His wife, Margaret, finally broke her silence during one of their dinners. She had been asking for more time together, for his attention, but every request had turned into a debate about why he was too busy, why his work was too important. That night, she said quietly, "Jonathan, I'm not looking for a lawyer in this house. I'm looking for a husband." The words pierced him deeper than any courtroom defeat ever could. For the first time, Jonathan saw himself not as the noble defender of truth he imagined, but as a man so consumed with winning that he was driving away the people he loved. The change began slowly. Jonathan decided to test Judge Harrison's advice. The next town hall arrived, and this time, instead of preparing an arsenal of counter-arguments, Jonathan simply listened. He leaned forward, nodded, and asked clarifying questions. When an older farmer spoke passionately about his fears of losing land to pollution, Jonathan resisted the urge to argue about economic numbers. Instead, he said, "I see how deeply this affects you. Tell me more about your experience." The room, which once braced for his sharp tongue, softened. People leaned in, surprised. Jonathan hadn't surrendered his values, but he had surrendered his need to attack. What Jonathan discovered that night was almost miraculous. People opened up to him. Instead of locking horns, they felt heard. Instead of preparing defenses, they shared their true feelings. Arguments that once spiraled into hostility now dissolved into dialogue. He realized that influence was not about conquering another's reasoning, it was about respecting their humanity. For the first time, Jonathan felt the power of connection outweigh the thrill of victory. The greatest test came months later when Jonathan faced a rival lawyer, Andrew Morton, in a legal negotiation. Morton was notorious for being aggressive, turning every discussion into a battle of egos. In the old days, Jonathan would have relished the duel. But this time, when Morton attacked Jonathan's proposal, Jonathan didn't argue back. Instead, he calmly asked, "Andrew, what's the biggest concern you see in this deal? I want to understand your side clearly." Morton was taken aback. He stumbled, then explained his fears in detail. Instead of rebutting every word, Jonathan nodded and worked to find common ground. By the end, what could have been a bitter courtroom war turned into a fair settlement. Jonathan didn't humiliate his opponent, he collaborated with him. Slowly, Jonathan's reputation began to shift. Colleagues described him not just as brilliant, but as wise. People trusted him more because they no longer feared being torn down by him. His marriage softened as well. Margaret found in him a partner who listened rather than spar. Their home became warmer, filled with conversations that didn't end in silence but in laughter. Jonathan began to see that arguments were like fires. When fueled, they raged, but when deprived of oxygen, they died quietly. Looking back, Jonathan realized how many years he had wasted proving himself right, but ending up alone. He saw clearly that no man, no matter how skilled in rhetoric, could ever truly win an argument, because the loser never forgets, and the bitterness lingers long after the words fade. By avoiding arguments, he hadn't become weak, he had become strong enough to resist the pull of his ego. One evening, Jonathan addressed a group of young law students at the local university. They asked him the secret of his success. He paused, then smiled faintly. For most of my career, I thought the secret was winning. Winning cases, winning debates, winning respect. But the truth is, I only began to succeed when I stopped trying to win arguments. The moment you stop trying to conquer people, you start connecting with them. And connection, my students, is the true victory. The auditorium was silent, the students leaning in as if hearing something they hungered for. From that day forward, Jonathan became known not only for his victories in court, but for his wisdom outside it. He often told the story of the night his wife reminded him that he was not a lawyer at home, but a husband. That line, he said, saved his marriage and perhaps his soul. The townspeople, who once bristled under his arguments, began inviting him to mediate disputes, not because he was the loudest voice, but because he was the calmest. He became a bridge builder, a man who healed divisions instead of deepening them. The years rolled on, and Milford itself transformed. The polluted river was cleaned not because Jonathan forced his arguments onto the factory owners, but because he invited them to listen to the townspeople, and he listened in return. Compromise was made, solutions found, and the river sparkled once more under the town's bridges. Jonathan would often walk those bridges at dusk with Margaret, reflecting on how much had changed, how much he had changed. When Jonathan grew old, people remembered him not for his sharp tongue, but for his open heart. They told stories of his patience, his wisdom, and his ability to dissolve conflicts that would otherwise have destroyed friendships, businesses, and even families. Children in Milford grew up hearing that Mr. Hale was the man who taught the town how to stop fighting and start listening. On the evening of his retirement from law, Jonathan stood before his colleagues, his voice steady but soft. I used to think victory was about proving others wrong. Now I know victory is about helping others feel understood. If you want the best of an argument, avoid it, not because you're afraid, but because you are strong enough to choose peace over pride. His words lingered in the room like a benediction, as if blessing every person who heard them. And so Jonathan Hale's legacy endured, not as a master of arguments, but as a master of understanding. He showed that life is not measured by the number of debates we win, but by the number of relationships we preserve, the bridges we build, and the hearts we keep open. His story became the living embodiment of Dale Carnegie's principle that the only way to truly win an argument is to never have one. For in choosing humility over pride, understanding over conquest, in peace over conflict, Jonathan found not just influence, but a life of harmony, love, and respect that outshone every courtroom victory he had ever claimed.